The deafening crack of splintering wood pierced the howling wind as Beatrice Ellis watched in horror as her wagon began to tip, the world around her tilting at an impossible angle. It was February 1878, and what had begun as flurries in Rico, Colorado had transformed into a merciless blizzard that now threatened to claim her life. Flynn Blackett had been tracking the storm for days, moving his cattle to lower ground when he spotted the lone wagon struggling against the mounting snowdrifts. He'd urged his horse forward, fighting against the biting wind that stung his face like 1,000 tiny needles. He was still 50 yards away when he saw the wagon begin to list dangerously to one side, the terrified horses pulling frantically as one wheel sank into a hidden crevasse. "Hold on," he shouted, though his voice was lost in the roar of the storm. The horses, panicked by the shifting weight, lurched forward. The wagon tipped further, balancing precariously for what seemed like an eternity before gravity won the battle. Flynn drove his spurs into his horse's flanks, covering the distance in seconds. He leapt from the saddle before his mount had fully stopped, plunging through snow up to his knees. A woman's scream cut through the howling wind, and Flynn's heart hammered against his ribs as he saw the wagon falling toward a steep embankment. "Jump!" he yelled, reaching the wagon just as it began its final descent. Inside, Beatrice clutched at anything she could find, her knuckles white with terror. Through the open flap, her eyes locked with Flynn's for a heartbeat before he lunged forward, strong arms reaching for her. His fingers closed around her wrist just as the wagon slipped further. With a powerful yank, he pulled her from the doomed vehicle, their bodies colliding as they fell backward into the snow. The wagon crashed down the embankment behind them, the sound of splintering wood and breaking glass muffled by the driving snow. Beatrice gasped for breath, her body trembling against Flynn's chest as they lay in the snow, his arms still wrapped protectively around her. "Are you hurt?" he shouted over the wind, pulling back slightly to examine her face. She shook her head, strands of dark hair escaping from beneath her bonnet, snowflakes catching in the loose tendrils. "My wagon," she managed, turning to look at the wreckage below. "Your wagon's lost," Flynn said firmly, helping her to her feet. "But you're not. We need shelter now." He gestured to the approaching darkness. "Night's coming fast and this storm's only getting worse." Beatrice nodded, suddenly aware of the biting cold seeping through her sodden clothes. Her entire life had been in that wagon, all her possessions, her supplies, everything she owned in the world now scattered across the ravine below. But the stranger was right. Survival came first. "I have a cabin," Flynn said, leading her toward his horse. "It's not far, but we need to move quickly." He helped her onto his horse before mounting behind her, one arm securely around her waist as he turned the animal into the wind. Beatrice leaned back against the solid warmth of his chest, grateful for the shelter his body provided against the driving snow. "I'm Beatrice Ellis," she said, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Flynn Blackett," he replied, his breath warm against her ear. "Hold tight, Miss Ellis. It's going to be a rough ride." As they pushed forward through the worsening blizzard, Beatrice closed her eyes against the stinging snow. Just hours ago, she had been full of determination, making her way to Rico to start a new life. Now, she was clinging to a stranger, heading to an unknown destination, everything she owned lost to the Colorado wilderness. Flynn's cabin appeared like a mirage through the blinding white, a solid, square structure nestled against a rocky outcropping that shielded it from the worst of the wind. He dismounted quickly, helping Beatrice down before leading the exhausted horse to a small lean-to attached to the cabin's side. "Get inside," he urged, pressing a key into her hand and pointing to the door. "Get warm. I'll see to the horse." Beatrice's fingers were nearly numb as she fumbled with the key, finally pushing the door open and stumbling inside. The cabin was simple but sturdy, one room with a stone fireplace, a bed in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves stocked with provisions. The remains of a fire glowed in the hearth, and Beatrice moved toward it gratefully, extending her trembling hands to the meager heat. Flynn entered moments later, bringing a blast of cold air with him before shoving the door closed against the wind. He moved efficiently around the cabin, adding logs to the fire, lighting lanterns, and pulling blankets from a trunk at the foot of the bed. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said, placing a blanket and what appeared to be a flannel shirt and trousers on the table. "I'll step outside while you change." "You'll freeze," Beatrice protested, looking at the raging storm visible through the cabin's small window. Flynn hesitated, then nodded. "I'll turn my back then," he said, moving to face the wall. "But you need to get dry or you'll catch your death." Beatrice turned away, her frozen fingers struggling with the buttons of her sodden coat and dress. The silence in the cabin was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside. She slipped on Flynn's shirt, which hung to her knees, and the trousers, which she had to roll up several times at the ankles. "I'm decent," she said softly, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders for good measure. Flynn turned, his expression unreadable as he assessed her. "You should sit by the fire," he said, gesturing to a chair he'd pulled close to the hearth. "I'll make something warm to drink." As he busied himself at the small stove, Beatrice studied him covertly. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' growth of beard. His hair was dark brown, almost black, and fell in unruly waves to his collar. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to fending for himself. "Have you lived here long?" she asked, breaking the silence. 4 years, he replied, pouring steaming liquid into 2 tin cups. "It's not much, but it's mine." He handed her a cup. "Careful, it's hot." Beatrice wrapped her hands around the warm metal, inhaling the fragrant steam. "Coffee with a splash of whiskey," he admitted. "Best thing for the cold." She took a cautious sip, the liquid burning a welcome path down her throat. "Thank you," she said, meeting his eyes, "for saving my life out there." Flynn shrugged, settling into the chair opposite her. "Couldn't very well ride past and leave you to die." He studied her over the rim of his cup. "What brings you to these parts alone, Miss Ellis? Rico's not exactly a destination for a lady traveling by herself." Beatrice stared into the flames, considering how much to reveal. "I'm going to open a millinery shop," she said finally. "I've had all my supplies in the wagon. Fabrics, ribbons, feathers. Everything I needed to start a business. A hat shop. In Rico." Flynn's eyebrows rose. "It's a mining town, Miss Ellis, not much call for ladies' fancy hats." "There are women there," Beatrice countered. "Wives of miners and merchants. And where there are women, there's a desire for beauty." She sighed, looking down at her borrowed clothes. "Or at least, that was the plan before my wagon went over that embankment." Flynn was quiet for a moment, watching the fire. "The storm should pass by morning," he said finally. "Once it does, we can go down and see what's salvageable." "You do that?" Beatrice asked, surprised. "Not much else to do in February," he replied with a slight smile. "Besides, I'm curious to see what kind of woman thinks she can make a living selling hats to miners' wives in the middle of nowhere." Despite everything, Beatrice found herself smiling back. "A stubborn one, Mr. Blackett. A very stubborn one." As the night deepened, the wind continued to howl around the cabin, but inside, it was warm and surprisingly comfortable. Flynn prepared a simple meal of beans and bacon, and they ate in companionable silence, the events of the day catching up to Beatrice as fatigue began to set in. "You take the bed," Flynn said, noticing her stifled yawn. "I'll sleep by the fire." "I couldn't possibly. You can and you will," he interrupted firmly. "You've had a shock and you need proper rest." Too exhausted to argue, Beatrice nodded gratefully. The bed, though narrow, was heaped with quilts and surprisingly comfortable. As she settled beneath the covers, she watched Flynn spread a bedroll near the hearth. "Mr. Blackett," she said softly, "I don't know how I'll ever repay you for your kindness today." He looked up, his face half in shadow. "Get some sleep, Miss Ellis. Tomorrow's soon enough to worry about debts and repayment." Beatrice closed her eyes, listening to the storm raging outside and the occasional crackle of the fire within. Despite the disaster that had befallen her, despite losing nearly everything she owned, she felt strangely at peace. Perhaps it was the exhaustion, or perhaps it was the knowledge that, had Flynn Blackett not appeared when he did, she would likely be dead, buried beneath her wagon in the Colorado snow. Either way, as sleep claimed her, her last thought was of the stranger's strong arms pulling her to safety, and the look in his eyes when he'd first seen her, not just concern, but something else. Something that had made her heart beat faster, even in the midst of danger. Morning arrived with an eerie silence. The absence of the howling wind woke Beatrice more effectively than any rooster's crow. She opened her eyes to find sunlight streaming through the cabin's small window, casting golden patterns across the rough-hewn floor. Flynn was already up, stoking the fire and putting coffee on to boil. He looked over when she stirred, offering a brief nod. "Storm's past," he said. "We've got clear skies, at least for now." Beatrice sat up, clutching the quilt around her shoulders. "How bad is it outside?" 3 feet of new snow, at least," he replied, pouring coffee into a cup and bringing it to her. "But the sun's strong. It'll start melting quick enough." She accepted the coffee gratefully, breathing in its rich aroma. "I need to see what's left of my wagon," she said, determination setting her jaw. "As soon as possible." Flynn studied her for a moment, then nodded. "We'll go after breakfast. Your clothes should be dry by now." He gestured to where her dress and coat hung near the fire. "I'll step outside while you change." True to his word, after a breakfast of cornbread and more coffee, Flynn saddled his horse while Beatrice dressed in her now dry clothes. The world outside was transformed, a blinding white landscape under a brilliant blue sky. Beatrice shielded her eyes against the glare as she stepped from the cabin. "It's beautiful," she murmured, despite herself. "And deadly," Flynn reminded her, helping her onto the horse before mounting behind her. "That's the treachery of these mountains. They'll show you heaven 1 minute and send you to hell the next." The ride to the site of the accident was slower than Beatrice would have liked, with Flynn carefully picking his way through snowdrifts that sometimes reached the horse's chest. When they finally reached the spot where the wagon had gone over, Beatrice's heart sank. From their vantage point, she could see the vehicle at the bottom of the ravine, its canvas top torn away, the wooden frame shattered beyond repair. "I need to go down there," she said, her voice tight with determination. Flynn frowned. "It's steep and treacherous. The snow could give way under your feet." "Everything I own is down there," she insisted. "I have to try." After a moment's consideration, Flynn dismounted and helped her down. "We'll go together," he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't up for debate. "Stay close and step exactly where I step." The descent was perilous, with both of them sliding more than once on the snow-covered slope. Beatrice's heart pounded with each slip, but Flynn's strong hand was always there, steadying her, keeping her from falling. When they finally reached the wreckage, Beatrice wanted to weep. The wagon lay on its side, half buried in snow, its contents scattered across a 20-yard radius. Bolts of fabric hung from broken tree branches like strange, colorful flags. Boxes of ribbons and feathers had burst open, their contents now sodden and frozen. "Oh no," she whispered, kneeling beside a shattered crate of hat forms. "It's all ruined." Flynn moved methodically through the wreckage, occasionally stopping to dig something out of the snow. "Not everything," he called, holding up a leather satchel. "This seems intact." Beatrice rushed to him, taking the bag with trembling hands. Inside were her personal belongings, a small daguerreotype of her parents, a few pieces of jewelry, letters, and most importantly, the pouch containing her savings. "Thank God," she breathed, clutching the satchel to her chest. For the next hour, they salvaged what they could, a few bolts of fabric that had remained dry inside waterproof oilcloth, a box of sewing notions that had somehow landed in the protective hollow of a tree trunk, and various other items that had survived the crash and the snow. "It's not much," Flynn observed, looking at the small pile they'd accumulated. "But it's something." Beatrice nodded, trying to maintain her composure. "More than I expected," she said, her voice only slightly unsteady. "Enough to start over, perhaps." Flynn watched her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "The snow's going to make travel impossible for at least a week," he said finally. "Maybe longer. You're welcome to stay at my cabin until the pass is clear." Beatrice looked up at him, surprise evident on her face. "That's very kind, but I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition," he interrupted. "I've got the space, and it wouldn't be right to send you off alone with the trails in this condition." His gaze softened slightly. "Besides, I could use the company. Gets quiet up here, especially in winter." There was something in his voice, a hint of loneliness perhaps, that resonated with Beatrice. She had been alone for so long herself, determined to make her own way in the world. The thought of a week in the company of this quiet, capable man was not unpleasant. "Thank you," she said finally. "I accept your offer, Mr. Blackett, but I insist on earning my keep. I can cook, clean, mend, whatever is needed." A small smile tugged at the corner of Flynn's mouth. "Well, I won't turn down a home-cooked meal that isn't my own," he admitted. "And I've got shirts that have been waiting for mending longer than I care to admit." They gathered the salvaged items, Flynn fashioning a makeshift sled from broken wagon planks to transport everything up the slope. The climb back was as treacherous as the descent, but they managed it without incident, loading the recovered goods onto Flynn's patient horse. As they rode back to the cabin, Beatrice leaning against Flynn's chest for balance, she found herself wondering about this solitary man who had saved her life. What had brought him to this remote cabin? Why did he live alone, miles from the nearest town? And why did the warmth of his body against her back feel so comforting, so right? Questions without answers, at least for now. But as the cabin came into view, Beatrice realized she had time, a week or more of enforced proximity, to discover the mysteries of Flynn Blackett. The thought sent an unexpected thrill through her, warming her more thoroughly than any fire could. The first few days of their unexpected cohabitation established a rhythm that surprised both of them with its ease. Mornings began with Flynn tending to his horse and chopping wood while Beatrice prepared breakfast. After eating, they would part ways, Flynn to check his trap lines or hunt, Beatrice to inventory her salvaged supplies and begin planning how to rebuild her business with what little remained. In the evenings, they shared the cooking duties, Flynn proving surprisingly adept at preparing venison and rabbit. After dinner, they sat by the fire, Beatrice mending Flynn's clothes while he carved intricate wooden figures with a skill that astonished her. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked on the fourth night, watching as his knife transformed a simple block of pine into what was clearly becoming a horse. Flynn glanced up, seeming almost embarrassed. "My father taught me," he said, his fingers never ceasing their careful work. "He was a furniture maker back in Pennsylvania." Said I had his hands. Beatrice set down her mending, intrigued by this first personal revelation. "Is your family still there, in Pennsylvania?" A shadow crossed Flynn's face. "No," he said, his voice neutral. "They're gone. Pa died of pneumonia when I was 17. Ma followed a year later. Some say of a broken heart, but it was consumption that took her." "I'm sorry," Beatrice said softly. "I lost my parents, too. Cholera outbreak in Chicago 6 years ago." Flynn nodded, acknowledging their shared grief. "Is that when you decided to become a milliner?" "Not exactly," Beatrice replied, picking up her mending again. "I'd been apprenticed to Mrs. Winters, the finest milliner in Chicago, since I was 15. My parents wanted me to have a skill, a way to support myself if needed." She smiled slightly at the memory. "They never imagined I'd end up trying to sell hats in a mining town in Colorado." "What brought you west?" Flynn asked, setting aside his carving to give her his full attention. Beatrice hesitated, unused to speaking of her past. But there was something in Flynn's steady gaze that invited confidence. "After my parents died, I continued working for Mrs. Winters," she explained. "But then her son returned from his business ventures back east. He took an interest in me." Flynn's expression darkened. "An unwanted interest." It wasn't a question, but Beatrice nodded. "He was persistent, despite my repeated refusals. When he became threatening, I knew I had to leave." She sighed, threading her needle through the fabric of Flynn's shirt. "I'd read about the opportunities in the West, how women with skills were valued. I saved every penny for 2 years, then bought the wagon and supplies. And set out alone," Flynn finished, respect evident in his voice. "That took courage, or foolishness," Beatrice replied with a rueful smile. As the blizzard demonstrated, Flynn shook his head. "Bad luck isn't the same as foolishness. You had a plan, supplies, determination. The storm could have caught anyone." His defense warmed her more than she cared to admit. "And what about you?" she asked, turning the conversation. "What brings a skilled furniture maker's son to a cabin in the Colorado mountains?" For a moment, she thought he might not answer. His fingers traced the outline of the wooden horse, his eyes distant. "The war," he said finally. "I fought with the Union Army. When it ended, I couldn't go back to Pennsylvania. Too many ghosts." He set the carving aside. "I drifted west, worked cattle drives, did some prospecting, tried my hand at trapping, eventually bought this land." "And you've been here ever since?" Beatrice prompted when he fell silent. 4 years now," he confirmed. "It suits me, quiet, simple, no one expecting anything from me." His eyes met hers. "Until you came along with your wagon in the middle of a blizzard." The teasing note in his voice made her smile. "Well, I do apologize for the inconvenience, Mr. Blackett." "Flynn," he said suddenly, "if we're going to be sharing this cabin for who knows how long, you might as well use my given name." Beatrice nodded, feeling a small shift in the air between them. "Flynn," she repeated, liking the feel of it on her lips. "And you should call me Beatrice." "Beatrice," he echoed, the name sounding different in his deep voice, more musical somehow, more significant. They lapsed into companionable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the soft scrape of Flynn's knife against wood. But something had changed, a boundary crossed, a distance shortened. Beatrice could feel it in the way her heart beat a little faster when Flynn's eyes met hers, in the way her skin tingled when their hands accidentally brushed as they passed dishes at dinner. It was dangerous, this growing awareness. In a week or two, the snow would melt enough for her to continue to Rico. She would thank Flynn for his kindness and be on her way, leaving him to his solitude. Becoming attached would only make the inevitable parting more difficult. Yet as the evening wore on, and she watched Flynn's strong hands coax a beautiful form from a simple block of wood. Beatrice found herself wondering what it might be like to stay. To share more evenings by the fire, more meals at the small table, more conversations that revealed the man behind the quiet exterior. Dangerous thoughts indeed. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Beatrice woke to find Flynn already gone. A note on the table explaining he'd gone to check his trap line and would be back by midday. Left to her own devices, she set about thoroughly cleaning the cabin, grateful for the physical activity to distract her from her confusing thoughts. She was on her hands and knees scrubbing the floor when she discovered the loose floorboard near the bed. Her cloth caught on its edge, and when she went to press it back into place, it lifted completely, revealing a small space beneath. Curiosity overcame propriety, and Beatrice peered into the hiding spot. Inside lay a small wooden box, meticulously crafted with inlaid patterns of darker wood. It was clearly Flynn's work. She recognized the style from his carvings. After a moment's hesitation, she lifted it out, telling herself she would simply replace the floorboard properly and put the box back. But the box was unlocked, and before she could talk herself out of it, Beatrice had opened the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded blue velvet, lay a collection of treasures. A tarnished silver pocket watch, a small leather-bound book, a pressed flower preserved between two pieces of glass, and most surprisingly, a daguerreotype of a young woman. Beatrice lifted the image carefully, studying the face captured in the silvery surface. The woman was beautiful, with large eyes and a serious expression, her dark hair arranged in an elaborate style that had been fashionable before the war. She wore a high-necked dress with a cameo at her throat, and her hands were folded primly in her lap. "That's Louisa." Beatrice gasped, nearly dropping the photograph as Flynn's voice came from behind her. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, hastily replacing the daguerreotype and closing the box. "The floorboard was loose and I was just trying to fix it. I didn't mean to pry." Flynn crossed the room slowly, taking the box from her trembling hands. For a long moment he simply looked at it, his thumb tracing the inlaid pattern on the lid. Then, to Beatrice's surprise, he sat on the edge of the bed and opened it again. "Louisa Gray," he said, removing the daguerreotype and holding it so Beatrice could see. "My fiancée before the war." Relief that he wasn't angry warred with curiosity in Beatrice's mind. "She's beautiful," she said softly, settling tentatively on the bed beside him. Flynn nodded, his eyes on the image. She was, inside and out. He carefully placed the daguerreotype back in the box and withdrew the pocket watch. "This was her father's. He gave it to me when I asked for her hand." A sad smile touched his lips. "Said if I was going to marry his daughter, I should always know what time to come home for dinner." Beatrice smiled at that, watching as Flynn replaced the watch and took out the pressed flower. "And this, from her grave," he said quietly. "Mountain laurel, it was her favorite." The simple statement hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken grief. Beatrice's heart ached for him. "What happened?" she asked gently. Flynn closed the box, his hands lingering on its polished surface. "She died while I was away fighting," he said, his voice low. "Diphtheria swept through our town in '63. By the time her letter reached me, she'd been gone 3 weeks. He set the box aside, his gaze moving to the fire. "I didn't go home after the war. Couldn't bear to see her house, her family, all the places we'd planned to build our life together. So I came west instead." "To outrun the memories," Beatrice murmured, understanding dawning. Flynn looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since entering the cabin. "Something like that," he agreed. "Though they have a way of following no matter how far you run." Impulsively, Beatrice reached out and covered his hand with hers. "I'm sorry I intruded on your private memories," she said, "and I'm sorry for your loss." Flynn turned his hand beneath hers, their palms meeting, his fingers curling around hers. "Don't be sorry for looking," he said. "I've kept these hidden away too long, like pieces of myself I didn't want to face." His eyes held hers, searching. "Maybe it's time I stopped hiding." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Beatrice was acutely aware of his hand holding hers, the warmth of his body beside her on the narrow bed, the way his eyes had darkened as they looked at her. The spell was broken by a gust of wind that rattled the cabin's windows, making them both jump slightly. Flynn released her hand, standing and carefully returning the box to its hiding place before replacing the floorboard. "I brought back a wild turkey," he said, his voice deliberately casual as he moved toward the door. "Thought we might roast it for dinner." "That sounds wonderful," Beatrice replied, grateful for the return to normalcy even as part of her mourned the loss of the intimate moment. "I'll start preparing it right away." As Flynn went back outside to fetch the bird, Beatrice remained seated on the bed, her hand still warm from his touch. She had glimpsed the man behind the quiet facade today, the young soldier who had lost his love, the craftsman who created beauty from simple wood, the solitary soul who had carved out a life for himself in these mountains. And in that glimpse, she had seen something that both thrilled and terrified her. A man she could love if she allowed herself the chance. The turkey dinner that evening was the most elaborate meal they'd shared, with Beatrice using the last of her salvaged spices to create a savory stuffing. Flynn contributed wild onions and late-season potatoes he'd stored in the root cellar beneath the cabin, and they even opened a precious jar of preserved blackberries for dessert. The conversation flowed more easily than before, as if Flynn's revelation about Louisa had removed a barrier between them. He spoke more freely of his childhood in Pennsylvania, of his father's woodworking shop, where he'd spent hours learning to coax beauty from raw lumber. In return, Beatrice shared stories of her apprenticeship, describing the elaborate hats she'd helped create for Chicago's society ladies. "I still don't understand why Rico," Flynn said as they lingered over their blackberries. "There must be a dozen larger towns that would better appreciate your skills." Beatrice smiled, twirling her spoon in the sweet juice. "That's precisely why I chose it," she explained. "The larger towns already have established milliners. In Rico, I'd be the only one offering fine ladies' hats for 100 miles. "Clever," Flynn acknowledged with an appreciative nod. "Create a market where there isn't one yet." "Exactly, and miners with money to spend often want to see their wives in the latest fashions." She set down her spoon, her expression growing serious. "Or at least, that was the plan before the accident. Now, with most of my supplies gone." "You could still do it," Flynn said, surprising her with his conviction. "From what I've seen of the fabrics and trimmings we salvaged, you've got enough for a start. And Rico has a general store that carries basic supplies." Beatrice was touched by his encouragement. "Perhaps," she conceded, "though it will be a much more modest beginning than I'd planned." "Most worthwhile things start modestly," Flynn replied, rising to stoke the fire. "This cabin was nothing but a crude shelter when I first built it. Each year I've added to it, improved it." He gestured around the room, which Beatrice now noticed showed evidence of careful craftsmanship in the smoothly joined walls, the sturdy shelves, the well-made furniture. "Small beginnings don't dictate the final outcome." His words kindled a renewed sense of determination in Beatrice. "You're right," she said, standing to help clear the dishes. "I can still make this work. It may take longer, but I've never been afraid of hard work." Flynn smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his usually serious face. "No, I don't imagine you have been, Beatrice Ellis." The way he said her name sent a pleasant shiver down her spine. She busied herself with the dishes, trying to ignore the flutter in her stomach when their hands brushed as he passed her plates to dry. Outside, the temperature dropped as night fell, and the wind picked up again, whistling around the cabin's eaves. Flynn checked the fire one last time before they retired, adding enough logs to last through the coldest hours. "Sounds like another storm brewing," he observed, glancing toward the window where snowflakes had begun to swirl in the darkness. "Might be a few more days before the trails clear." Beatrice found herself surprisingly untroubled by the prospect of extending her stay. "I'm not in any rush," she admitted. "Your hospitality has been more than I could have hoped for." Flynn turned from the fire, his eyes finding hers across the room. "Having you here has been unexpected," he said carefully, "but not unwelcome." It wasn't quite a declaration, but something in his voice, a certain softness, a hint of vulnerability, made Beatrice's heart quicken. "I've enjoyed your company as well," she replied, the simple words inadequate to express the complex emotions stirring within her. Flynn held her gaze for a long moment before nodding once. "Good night, Beatrice," he said, moving to his bedroll by the fire. "Sleep well." "Good night, Flynn," she responded, retreating to the bed that still smelled faintly of him despite the fresh linens she'd put on it days ago. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the wind and the occasional pop from the fireplace, Beatrice acknowledged the truth she'd been trying to deny. She was falling for Flynn Blackett. His quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness, his resilience in the face of loss, all of it drew her to him like a moth to flame. But what did he feel for her? Kindness, certainly. Perhaps attraction. But was he ready to open his heart again after Louisa? And even if he was, what future could they have? She was determined to open her shop in Rico, to build the independent life she'd planned. Flynn seemed equally committed to his solitary existence in this remote cabin. These thoughts circled in Beatrice's mind as sleep eluded her. Across the room, she could hear Flynn's steady breathing, though she sensed he too was awake, perhaps wrestling with similar questions. Outside, the storm gathered strength, as if mirroring the turbulence in her heart. Morning brought confirmation of Flynn's prediction. Another blizzard had descended on the mountains, this one even fiercer than the first. Snow piled against the cabin windows, and the wind howled like a living thing, seeking entry through every crack and crevice. "We're snowed in for at least 3 days," Flynn announced after a brief, frigid excursion to check on his horse and gather more firewood. "Maybe longer if it keeps up like this." Beatrice nodded, pouring him a cup of coffee as he shed his snow-covered coat by the door. "I've taken inventory of our supplies," she said. "We have plenty of flour, coffee, salt pork, and beans. The vegetables might run low if we're truly stuck for more than a week." Flynn accepted the coffee gratefully, his hands red from the cold despite his leather gloves. "There's smoked venison in the storage shed, and I've got traps set closer to the cabin that I can check even in this weather." He took a sip, sighing appreciatively at the warmth. "We won't go hungry." "Then I suppose we'll just have to find ways to pass the time," Beatrice said, trying to ignore the flutter in her stomach at the thought of more days alone with Flynn in the intimate confines of the cabin. They settled into a new routine dictated by the storm. Flynn ventured out briefly each morning to care for his horse and check the nearest traps, returning with additional firewood and, occasionally, a rabbit or squirrel to supplement their provisions. Beatrice kept the cabin warm and comfortable, cooking meals, mending clothes, and using the salvaged fabric to begin crafting simple hats that might form the start of her inventory when she finally reached Rico. In the afternoons and evenings, they really talked in a way neither had done with anyone in years. Flynn told Beatrice about the war, about the horror of battle and the guilt of survival when so many others didn't make it home. She spoke of her fears after her parents died, of struggling alone in a city that could be cruelly indifferent to a young woman without family. "I used to wake up terrified," she admitted one evening as they sat before the fire, Flynn whittling and Beatrice stitching ribbons to the brim of a simple straw hat. "Afraid that I'd end up destitute or forced to marry someone I didn't love just for security." Flynn's hands stilled on his carving. "Is that why you're so determined to have your own business? For security?" "Partly," she acknowledged, "but also for the freedom it represents, to make my own choices, answer to no one but myself." She looked up from her work, meeting his eyes. "I watched my mother defer to my father in everything, even when she knew he was wrong. I swore I'd never put myself in that position." Flynn nodded slowly. "Independence is precious," he agreed, "worth fighting for." He resumed his carving, his knife moving in sure, practiced strokes. "Though I've learned there's a difference between independence and isolation. One is strength, the other can become a kind of prison." Beatrice studied him, wondering if he was speaking of himself. "Have you been imprisoned here, Flynn?" she asked softly. "In your isolation?" He didn't answer immediately, his focus seemingly on the wood taking shape beneath his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Maybe, for a time." His eyes lifted to hers. "Less so these past days." The admission hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Beatrice felt her cheeks warm under his steady gaze, and she returned her attention to her sewing, though her fingers trembled slightly. "What are you making?" she asked, nodding toward the carving in his hands, eager to ease the tension of the moment. Flynn held up the nearly completed figure, a delicate wooden rose, each petal distinct and lifelike despite the medium. "For you," he said simply, "to replace some of what you lost in the accident." Touched beyond words, Beatrice set aside her sewing and reached for the carving. Flynn placed it in her palm, his fingers lingering against hers for a heartbeat longer than necessary. The wooden rose was exquisite, capturing the essence of the flower in its unfurling petals and gently curved stem. "It's beautiful," she whispered, tracing a finger over the detailed work. "I've never received anything quite like it. It's nothing compared to what you lost," Flynn said, a hint of embarrassment coloring his tone. "But I thought, well, you might like to have something." "I'll treasure it always," Beatrice assured him, meeting his eyes. "Thank you, Flynn." Something shifted in that moment, a barrier falling, a decision made. Flynn reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His hand lingered, cupping her cheek with a gentleness that made her heart ache. "Beatrice," he murmured, her name a question and an answer all at once. She leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "Yes," she whispered, though he hadn't spoken the question aloud. Flynn closed the distance between them, his lips meeting hers in a kiss as gentle as his touch. Beatrice's eyes fluttered closed, the wooden rose clutched carefully in one hand while the other reached up to rest against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart. The kiss deepened, Flynn's hand sliding from her cheek to the nape of her neck, drawing her closer. Beatrice responded with a fervor that surprised them both, years of carefully maintained propriety giving way to genuine passion. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Flynn rested his forehead against hers. "I didn't plan for this," he admitted softly. "For you. For feeling this way again." "Nor I," Beatrice replied, her eyes still closed, savoring the moment. "But here we are." Flynn drew back slightly, his expression serious as he studied her face. "Here we are," he echoed. "But where do we go from here? You're still set on Rico, on your shop." Beatrice opened her eyes, reality intruding on the perfect moment. "And you're committed to this place," she said, glancing around the cabin that was so clearly Flynn's home, built with his hands, shaped by his vision. "It doesn't have to be one or the other," Flynn said, surprising her. "Rico is only a day's ride from here in good weather, less if the horse is fresh." His thumb traced the outline of her jaw. "We could find a way if we wanted to." Hope bloomed in Beatrice's chest, tentative but unmistakable. "Are you saying you want to try to find a way for us to be together?" Flynn nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've been alone a long time, Beatrice. Longer than was good for me, I think. Meeting you, having you here these past days." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "It's like waking up after a long sleep. I don't want to go back to the way things were before." Beatrice closed her eyes briefly, overwhelmed by emotion. "Nor do I," she admitted. "But I'm afraid, too, it's all happening so fast. We have time," Flynn assured her, taking her hands in his. "The snow isn't going anywhere soon. We can talk, make plans, or simply be and see where this leads us." Beatrice nodded, relieved by his understanding. "I'd like that," she said, squeezing his hands. "To see where this leads." Flynn smiled, the expression transforming his face, making him look younger, unburdened. He leaned forward and kissed her again, briefly but tenderly. "For now, that's enough," he murmured against her lips. As they sat by the fire, hands entwined, the storm outside seemed to recede in importance. Whatever uncertainties the future held in this moment, they had found something precious. A connection neither had expected but both now cherished. The blizzard raged for 3 more days, keeping them confined to the cabin, but providing precious time for their newfound relationship to deepen. They spoke of their pasts more openly now, sharing dreams and disappointments, fears and hopes. Flynn told Beatrice about his plans to expand his cabin in the spring, to add a proper workshop where he could craft furniture to sell in nearby towns. She described in detail the hats she hoped to create, sketching designs on scraps of paper that Flynn provided. In the evenings, they sat close together by the fire, sometimes reading aloud from Flynn's small collection of books, sometimes simply talking late into the night. And there were kisses, tentative at first, then increasingly confident as they explored this new territory between them. They maintained their separate sleeping arrangements, though both found it increasingly difficult to say goodnight. There was an unspoken agreement that some boundaries would remain until their future was more certain. On the morning of the 4th day after their first kiss, Flynn returned from his usual check of the horse and traps with news. "The storm's breaking," he announced, stamping snow from his boots by the door. "Skies clearing to the west. If the sun stays out today, the trail to Rico might be passable by tomorrow." Beatrice looked up from the hat she was trimming, her heart giving an odd lurch at the news. "So soon?" she said, unable to keep the dismay from her voice. Flynn crossed to her, kneeling beside her chair and taking her hands in his. "We knew this day would come," he said gently. "The snow couldn't last forever." "I know," she sighed, looking down at their joined hands. "It's just being here with you, it's been like living in another world. A simpler one. Going back to reality seems frightening," Flynn suggested when she trailed off. Beatrice nodded. "What if everything changes once we leave this cabin, once we're back in the real world with all its complications?" Flynn lifted her hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles softly. "Some things will change," he acknowledged, "but what matters most doesn't have to." He caught her gaze, his eyes serious. "What I feel for you, Beatrice, that won't change with the weather." She searched his face, finding nothing but sincerity there. "Nor will my feelings for you," she said softly. Flynn nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "Then we face whatever comes next together." He stood, still holding her hands. "Come with me today. There's something I want to show you before you leave for Rico." Curious, Beatrice set aside her work and allowed Flynn to help her into her coat and boots. Outside, the world glittered under a blanket of fresh snow, the air crisp and clear after days of swirling white. The sun shone from a brilliant blue sky, making the landscape almost painfully bright. Flynn led her around the cabin and up a gentle slope that she hadn't explored during her stay. The snow was deep, but he forged a path for her, holding her hand to steady her when she stumbled. After about 15 minutes of climbing, they reached a small plateau and Flynn stepped aside, gesturing for Beatrice to look ahead. The view took her breath away. Below them lay a valley, pristine in its winter coat, with mountains rising majestically beyond. And there, nestled against the far slopes, was a small collection of buildings Rico. "You can see the town from here," Flynn explained, coming to stand beside her. "I come up sometimes, especially when I'm feeling too isolated. Seeing the smoke from chimneys, knowing there are people living their lives just a day's journey away." He shrugged. "It helps." Beatrice gazed at the distant town, then back at Flynn. "It's beautiful," she said, "all of it." She understood now why he had brought her here, to show her that his world and hers weren't as separate as they might seem. That perhaps they could build a life that encompassed both. "I've been thinking," Flynn said, his breath forming clouds in the cold air, "about your shop in Rico and my cabin here." He turned to face her fully. "What if you didn't have to choose between them? What if you could have both?" Beatrice's heart quickened. "What do you mean?" "Rent a small place in town for your shop," he suggested. "Work there during the week. But make your home here with me." His eyes held hers, vulnerable yet hopeful. "I could bring you to town on Mondays, pick you up on Fridays. It's not a perfect solution, but—" "Yes," Beatrice interrupted, her decision made in an instant. "Yes, that could work. That could be perfect, actually." Her mind raced ahead, seeing how it might all fit together. "I could stay at the boarding house in town while I'm there and be here with you the rest of the time." Flynn's face lit with a joy she hadn't seen before. "You'd consider it, truly." "More than consider," she assured him, stepping closer until barely an inch separated them. "It solves everything I need to establish my business, your connection to this place you've built." She placed her hand on his chest, feeling his heart beating strong and steady beneath her palm. "And most importantly, it means we can be together." Flynn covered her hand with his own. "It won't be easy," he warned. "The journey between here and town can be treacherous, especially in winter. And people will talk an unmarried woman splitting her time between town and a cabin with a man." "Let them talk," Beatrice said with more confidence than she felt. "We know the truth of what's between us." She hesitated, then added softly, unless you're suggesting something more formal." Flynn's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, Beatrice feared she had misread the situation entirely. But then he smiled, slow and warm, and reached into his pocket. "I had planned to wait," he admitted, withdrawing something small that he kept concealed in his fist. "To give you time to court you properly. But if you're willing—" He opened his hand to reveal a ring, a simple band of polished wood with a small, perfect pearl set into its center. "I made this last night," he explained, his voice rough with emotion. "The wood is cherry from Pennsylvania, saved from my father's workshop. The pearl was my mother's, from a necklace my father gave her on their wedding day." Beatrice stared at the beautiful ring, tears welling in her eyes. "Flynn," she whispered, unable to say more. "I know it's fast," he said, suddenly uncertain. "Too fast, perhaps, and I'm not a wealthy man. This cabin, my horse, my skills, it's all I have to offer. But I love you, Beatrice Ellis. These past weeks have shown me that life is meant to be shared. I don't want to be alone anymore." I want to build a future with you." Beatrice looked from the ring to Flynn's face, seeing the vulnerability there, the hope, the love. Logic told her it was indeed too soon, that they barely knew each other, that sensible people didn't make life-changing decisions after less than 3 weeks' acquaintance. But her heart knew better. In their short time together, she had seen Flynn's character revealed in countless ways: his courage in rescuing her from the wagon, his kindness in offering shelter, his respect for her independence, his honesty about his past. She had seen him at his most vulnerable and his most strong. What more could a longer courtship reveal that would change her feelings? "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that now spilled freely down her cheeks. "Yes, Flynn Blackett, I will marry you." Joy transformed his face as he took her gloved hand and slipped the ring onto her finger over the fabric. "It might not fit perfectly," he apologized. "I guessed at the size." "It's perfect," Beatrice assured him, admiring the way the pearl caught the sunlight. "Absolutely perfect." She looked up at him, her heart so full it felt it might burst. "I love you, Flynn." He gathered her into his arms then, kissing her with a passion that warmed her despite the winter chill. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "We'll make it work," he promised. "Your shop, our home here, all of it." "I know we will," Beatrice replied, believing it with her whole heart. Together. They stood there on the hillside, the sun shining down on them, Rico gleaming in the distance, and Flynn's cabin nestled securely behind them, their past, present, and future all visible from this one perfect vantage point. The journey to Rico the next day was slow but manageable, with Flynn carefully guiding his horse along trails that were beginning to emerge from the melting snow. Beatrice rode behind him, her arms around his waist, her cheek pressed against his back. The wooden ring was safely tucked in her pocket, to be worn properly once they reached town, and could have it properly sized to her finger. They had decided to be honest about their situation, to tell people they had met when Flynn rescued her from the overturned wagon, that they had fallen in love during the storms that followed, and that they planned to marry as soon as the circuit preacher made his monthly visit to Rico. People might still talk, Flynn had warned as they packed her salvaged belongings that morning. A courtship this brief. Let them, Beatrice had replied with a confidence that surprised even her. We know the truth of our hearts. As they crested the final hill and Rico came into view, Beatrice felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The town was smaller than she remembered from her brief glimpse before the blizzard struck, just 2 streets of buildings with false fronts, a church, and scattered houses extending up the hillside. Smoke rose from chimneys and figures moved along the muddy main street, life continuing as it had while she and Flynn were isolated in their winter haven. "Nervous?" Flynn asked, sensing her tension as they began their descent into town. "A little," she admitted. "Everything's about to change." He reached back to squeeze her hand where it rested against his stomach. "Not everything," he promised. "Not what matters most." They rode directly to the boarding house, a 2-story building near the center of town. As they dismounted, several curious faces appeared in windows and doorways along the street. News traveled fast in small towns, and a stranger arriving with Flynn Blackett, the reclusive mountain man who rarely came to town except for supplies, was certainly noteworthy. The boarding house owner, Mrs. Peyton, a plump woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner, greeted them at the door. "Mr. Blackett," she said, her surprise evident. "Don't often see you in town this time of year." Her gaze shifted to Beatrice, assessment clear in her expression. "Mrs. Peyton," Flynn replied with a polite nod. "This is Miss Beatrice Ellis. She was traveling to Rico when her wagon overturned in the blizzard. I was fortunate enough to be nearby and offer assistance." His hand found the small of Beatrice's back, a subtle but clear gesture of support. "Miss Ellis is looking to establish a millinery shop here in town, and she'll need a room while she gets settled." Mrs. Peyton's eyebrows rose slightly, but her voice remained professionally neutral. "I see. Well, we do have rooms available." She looked more directly at Beatrice. "You're a hat maker, then?" "I am," Beatrice confirmed, standing a little straighter. "I trained in Chicago with Mrs. Winters, whose work has been featured in Peterson's magazine." This seemed to impress the older woman, whose expression softened slightly. "Well, Rico could certainly use some refinement," she admitted. "The ladies here make do with catalog orders, and those take months to arrive, often damaged by the journey." She gestured for them to follow her inside. "Come in, come in. We can discuss terms for the room, and perhaps you'll tell me more about these hats of yours." As they stepped into the warm entryway, Flynn squeezed Beatrice's hand reassuringly. "I'll see to the horse and your belongings," he murmured, "and make inquiries about available shop space." Beatrice nodded gratefully, then followed Mrs. Peyton up a narrow staircase to a small but clean room on the second floor. The furnishings were simple: a narrow bed, a washstand, a chest of drawers, and a rocking chair by the window, but after weeks in Flynn's one-room cabin, it seemed spacious enough. "Meals are served promptly at 7, 12, and 6, Mrs. Peyton explained, opening the curtains to let in more light. "No gentlemen callers in rooms, though you may receive visitors in the parlor until 8 in the evening." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Mr. Blackett seems quite concerned for your welfare." Beatrice took a deep breath, deciding that honesty was the best approach. "Mr. Blackett saved my life during the blizzard," she said, "and during the weeks I spent recovering at his cabin, we developed a deep attachment." She met the older woman's gaze steadily. "We intend to marry when the circuit preacher visits next month." To her surprise, Mrs. Peyton smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her stern face. "Well, that explains it," she said, sounding almost relieved. "I was beginning to think Flynn Blackett would live and die alone up in those mountains." She studied Beatrice with new interest. "You must be quite a woman to have drawn him back to the world of the living." Beatrice blushed under the scrutiny. "We found each other at the right time, I think," she said simply. Mrs. Peyton nodded sagely. "Love often works that way," she agreed. "Now about this shop of yours. There's a vacant storefront 2 doors down that might suit. Old Mr. Geller used it for his watch repair business before his eyes got too bad. It's small, but it has good light and a back room that could serve as storage." Beatrice's heart lifted at this unexpected support. "That sounds perfect," she said eagerly. "Is the owner in town? I'd like to inquire about it as soon as possible." "I own it," Mrs. Peyton replied with a small smile. "Along with half the buildings on this street, my late husband was a founding member of Rico's business community." She smoothed her apron with practiced hands. "I could show it to you this afternoon if you like. The rent is reasonable, particularly for a new business." "That would be wonderful," Beatrice said, grateful for the woman's kindness. "Thank you." Mrs. Peyton nodded and moved toward the door. "I'll leave you to get settled. Your fiancé can bring up your belongings when he returns." At the doorway, she paused, her expression softening further. "And Miss Ellis, welcome to Rico. We can always use another resourceful woman in these parts." Once alone, Beatrice moved to the window, gazing down at the muddy street below. Flynn was visible at the hitching post, unloading her salvaged supplies from the horse. A few curious townspeople had gathered, and she saw him speaking with them, his manner reserved but polite. In that moment, the reality of what they were undertaking struck her fully. This was not a dream or a temporary arrangement, this was the beginning of their life together. Flynn, emerging from his self-imposed isolation to support her dream. Beatrice, adapting her vision of independence to include partnership with this remarkable man. Both of them, building something new and unexpected from the ruins of a disaster. She touched the pocket where his wooden ring nestled safely, her heart full of determination and hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together just as they had faced the blizzard that had brought them to each other. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Beatrice rented the small storefront Mrs. Peyton had suggested, and with Flynn's help, transformed it into a cozy shop with a workbench by the window, shelves for displaying her creations, and a comfortable chair where customers could sit while being fitted. Word spread quickly through the small community about the new milliner and her unusual love story. Women began to stop by first out of curiosity, then with genuine interest in Beatrice's work. She started with simple designs using her salvaged materials, but orders soon began to come in, along with fabric and trimmings that customers provided from their own supplies. Flynn divided his time between his cabin and town, making the journey every few days to bring Beatrice additional supplies, help with improvements to the shop, and simply to be near her. He rented a room at the livery stable for nights when weather made the return journey inadvisable. But they were careful to maintain propriety, mindful of their positions as newcomers to the close-knit community. To Beatrice's relief, the townspeople seemed more accepting of their unconventional courtship than she had feared. The dramatic circumstances of their meeting the overturned wagon, Flynn's daring rescue, the weeks of blizzards that followed gave their romance the aura of destiny that appealed to frontier sensibilities. And Flynn's willingness to emerge from his solitude, to be seen regularly in town helping Beatrice establish her business, earned him a new respect from people who had previously viewed him as an eccentric recluse. As promised, the circuit preacher arrived in Rico on the first Sunday in March. Reverend Donovan was a robust man with a booming voice and a pragmatic approach to his far-flung flock. When Flynn and Beatrice approached him about performing their wedding ceremony, he asked only a few pointed questions about their acquaintance before agreeing. Life in these mountains doesn't always allow for lengthy courtships, he acknowledged, his eyes kind beneath bushy brows. And it seems to me that surviving a blizzard together might teach you more about each other than years of Sunday socials. The wedding took place the following day in Rico's small church, with what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Mrs. Peyton had helped Beatrice fashion a wedding dress from one of the salvaged bolts of cream-colored silk, and Flynn wore a new shirt and his cleanest trousers, his hair neatly trimmed for the occasion. As Beatrice walked down the short aisle toward Flynn, she felt none of the doubt or fear that might have been expected given the whirlwind nature of their relationship. Instead, she was filled with a quiet certainty that this man who had pulled her from a tipping wagon in a blizzard, who had sheltered her through the worst of winter, who had shown her that independence and love were not mutually exclusive, was exactly where her future lay. Flynn watched her approach, his expression so full of love and wonder that tears pricked at Beatrice's eyes. When she reached him and placed her hand in his, he squeezed gently, the wooden ring he had carved now properly sized to her finger and polished to a warm glow. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Donovan began, his voice filling the small church, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls brought together by Providence and a blizzard." A ripple of appreciative laughter passed through the congregation at this, and Beatrice smiled up at Flynn, seeing her own joy reflected in his eyes. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, their vows spoken clearly and with conviction. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Flynn's kiss was gentle but thorough, drawing cheers and a few good-natured whistles from the assembled townspeople. The celebration afterward was held at the town hall, with everyone contributing to a feast that stretched across 3 tables. There was dancing, Flynn surprising Beatrice with his grace as he led her in a waltz, his hand warm and steady at her waist. "Where did you learn to dance?" she whispered as they moved across the floor, aware of the admiring glances of the onlookers. "My mother insisted," he replied with a small smile. "Said no son of hers would grow up without knowing how to properly escort a lady across a dance floor." His eyes held hers. "I never thought I'd use the skill again after Louis had died." Beatrice's heart ached at the reminder of his loss, but there was no bitterness in his voice, only a quiet acknowledgement of the past. "I'm glad you remembered," she said softly. "Some things," Flynn murmured, drawing her imperceptibly closer. "The body doesn't forget. Dancing. Riding." His voice dropped lower, for her ears alone. "Loving." A blush heated Beatrice's cheeks at the promise in his words. Later that night, they would travel to Flynn's cabin, their cabin now, to begin their life as husband and wife in every sense. The thought sent a thrill of anticipation through her, mingled with natural nervousness. As if reading her thoughts, Flynn's hand tightened slightly at her waist. "We have all the time in the world, Beatrice," he assured her. "There's no rush for anything." She smiled up at him, love swelling in her heart for this man who always seemed to know exactly what she needed. "I'm not afraid," she told him truthfully. "Not with you." The dance ended, and they were immediately surrounded by well-wishers, the moment of intimacy broken but the connection between them stronger than ever. The celebration continued into the evening, but by sunset, Flynn was helping Beatrice onto his horse for the journey home. Several of the townspeople accompanied them to the edge of Rico, calling out good wishes and teasing remarks. Mrs. Peyton pressed a basket of food into Beatrice's hands, along with a knowing smile. "For when you get hungry later," she said with a wink that made Beatrice blush again. As they rode away from town, the setting sun painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of pink and gold, Beatrice leaned back against Flynn's chest, his arms secure around her as he guided the horse along the familiar trail. "Happy, Mrs. Blackett," he murmured against her ear, using her new name for the first time. "Completely, Mr. Blackett," she replied, turning her head to press a kiss to his jaw. "And you, more than I ever thought possible again," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "You've given me back a future, Beatrice. A reason to look forward rather than back." They rode in companionable silence for a time, each lost in their own thoughts as the trail wound through stands of pine and across open meadows still blanketed in snow. The air grew colder as the sun dipped below the horizon, but Beatrice felt only warmth, cocooned in Flynn's embrace and wrapped in the certainty of their love. When the cabin came into view, its windows dark against the twilight, Flynn halted the horse. "Wait," he said, dismounting and lifting Beatrice down beside him. "There's something I want to do properly." Before she could ask what he meant, he swept her into his arms, one arm beneath her knees, the other supporting her back. Beatrice laughed in surprise, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Flynn, you'll hurt yourself." "Not likely," he replied, carrying her toward the cabin with sure steps. "I carried you from that wagon in a blizzard, remember? You're light as a feather." At the door he paused, looking down at her with such tenderness that Beatrice's breath caught in her throat. "Welcome home, wife," he said softly, pushing the door open with his foot and carrying her across the threshold. Inside, Beatrice gasped in surprise. The cabin had been transformed in her absence. New curtains hung at the windows, The bed had been enlarged and fitted with a fresh mattress and colorful quilts, and a small vanity table with a mirror stood in the corner, clearly Flynn's handiwork, the wood polished to a warm glow. "When did you do all this?" she asked as he set her gently on her feet. "Bit by bit, while you were setting up the shop," he admitted, looking pleased at her reaction. "I wanted it to feel like our home, not just mine that you're moving into." Tears pricked at Beatrice's eyes as she took in the loving care evident in every detail. "It's perfect," she said, turning to face him. "Absolutely perfect." Flynn stepped closer, cupping her face in his hands. "You're perfect," he corrected softly. "And I'm the luckiest man in Colorado to call you my wife." Their lips met in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened, months of carefully maintained restraint finally giving way to the passion that had been building between them. Flynn's hand slid from her face to her shoulders, then down her back, drawing her closer against him. Beatrice's arms wound around his neck, her fingers threading through his hair as she surrendered to the sensations coursing through her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Flynn rested his forehead against hers. "I should see to the horse," he murmured, though he made no move to release her. "And bring in your things." "The horse can wait a few more minutes," Beatrice replied, surprising herself with her boldness. "And my things aren't going anywhere." Flynn's eyes darkened at her words, and he kissed her again, more urgently this time. "A few more minutes," he agreed, his voice rough with desire. "Or perhaps a few more hours." Later, much later, as they lay entwined beneath the quilts, the fire burning low in the hearth, Beatrice traced idle patterns on Flynn's chest, marveling at how perfectly they fit together, how natural it felt to be here with him, skin to skin, heart to heart. "What are you thinking?" Flynn asked, his fingers combing gently through her unbound hair. Beatrice smiled against his shoulder. "I was thinking about that day in the blizzard," she admitted. "How terrified I was when the wagon began to tip, how certain I was that I was going to die." She propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "And then you appeared like something from a dream and pulled me to safety." Flynn's hand cupped her cheek, his expression solemn. "I think perhaps we saved each other that day," he said quietly. "I was lost in my own way, living but not really alive. You changed that, Beatrice." She turned her head to press a kiss to his palm. "Then I'm glad my wagon tipped over," she said with a small smile. "Though perhaps next time I'll try to find a less dramatic way to meet a handsome stranger." Flynn laughed, pulling her back down against his chest. "No more handsome strangers for you, Mrs. Blackett," he said, mock severity in his tone. "You're stuck with this one for life." "Promise?" Beatrice asked, suddenly serious despite her playful words. Flynn's arms tightened around her. "I promise," he replied solemnly, "for as long as we both shall live." Spring came to the mountains with startling swiftness that year. One day the world was locked in winter's grip. The next, it seemed, snowmelt was running in rivulets down every slope, and the first green shoots were pushing through the softening earth. For Flynn and Beatrice, this first spring together was a time of adjustment and discovery. They settled into a routine that suited them both, Beatrice spending 3 days a week in Rico at her shop, which was flourishing beyond her most optimistic projections, and Flynn dividing his time between his trap lines, his newly expanded workshop, and occasional trips to town to help at the shop, or simply to see his wife during their brief separations. The arrangement raised a few eyebrows initially, but as Mrs. Peyton had predicted, the unconventional nature of their marriage soon became simply another accepted feature of life in Rico. It helped that both Flynn and Beatrice became increasingly involved in the community, Flynn offering his carpentry skills to help rebuild the school's roof after a late spring storm, Beatrice organizing a sewing circle that quickly became as much about female companionship as about needlework. In early June, just as the wildflowers were reaching their peak in the mountain meadows, Beatrice confirmed what she had suspected for several weeks. She was expecting a child. Flynn's reaction to the news was everything she could have hoped for: joy mixed with protective concern. Excitement about the future tempered with practical planning for the changes they would need to make. "We'll need to expand the cabin," he declared that evening as they sat on the porch he had added in April, watching the sunset paint the western peaks. "Add a proper bedroom for us and a nursery for the baby." Beatrice smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "We have time," she reminded him. "The baby won't arrive until winter." "All the more reason to start now," Flynn countered, his hand resting protectively over hers on her still flat stomach. "I want everything ready well before the snow flies." True to his word, Flynn began work on the expansion immediately, enlisting help from several men in town who were happy to repay his assistance with their own projects. By August, the cabin had nearly doubled in size, with a new bedroom for them, a smaller room for the baby, and an expanded kitchen area that made Beatrice's heart sing with delight. Her business continued to thrive through her pregnancy, with orders coming in not just from Rico, but from neighboring settlements as well. Flynn built her a special chair with extra cushioning for her back, and when her condition became too advanced for the daily ride between town and the cabin, they rented a small room behind her shop where she could rest between customers. The baby, a robust boy they named William Flynn Blackett, arrived in the depths of January, with Mrs. Peyton serving as midwife and Flynn pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door until the first lusty cry announced his son's arrival. When he was finally allowed in, the sight of Beatrice, tired but radiant, holding their swaddled child, brought tears to his eyes. "Come meet your son," she said softly, shifting the bundle so Flynn could see the tiny face, still red and wrinkled from the journey into the world. Flynn sat carefully on the edge of the bed, reaching out a tentative finger to touch the baby's cheek. "He's perfect," he whispered, awe evident in his voice. "Just like his mother." Beatrice smiled, leaning against Flynn's shoulder as they both gazed at their child. "I was thinking," she said, "that we might call him William after your father, if you'd like that." Flynn looked at her, surprise and gratitude in his eyes. "I would," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'd like that very much." Mrs. Peyton, who had been discreetly tidying up, sniffed loudly. "Well, I'll leave you three to get acquainted," she announced, wiping her hands on her apron. "But don't let her get overtired, Flynn Blackett. That was a long labor and she needs her rest." Flynn nodded seriously. "I'll take good care of them both," he promised, his tone making it clear this was a vow he intended to keep for the rest of his life. After Mrs. Peyton left, closing the door softly behind her, Flynn stretched out on the bed beside Beatrice, one arm around her shoulders, the other hand resting lightly on his son's blanket-wrapped form. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted quietly. "After Louisa, I believed that part of my life was over." Beatrice turned her face to press a kiss to his jaw. "I know," she said. "I felt the same way after Chicago. I was so determined to be independent, to never rely on anyone else." She looked down at their son, now sleeping peacefully against her breast. "But this is better. This family we're building together." Flynn tightened his arm around her. "Much better," he agreed. "Independence is important, but so is having someone to share your life with, to build something lasting together." He kissed her temple gently. "Thank you for taking a chance on me, on us." "Best chance I ever took," Beatrice murmured, leaning into his embrace. "Even if it did start with nearly being crushed by my own wagon." Flynn chuckled softly, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. "I'd pull you from 100 tipping wagons if it meant ending up here, with you and William." Outside, snow fell softly against the windows, another winter storm moving in. But inside the cabin that had grown from a solitary man's refuge to a family home, all was warmth and light and love, a haven built through chance and choice, disaster and determination, and the courage to begin again when life takes an unexpected turn. As Flynn held his wife and newborn son, he silently thanked whatever fate or providence had led him to that snow-covered trail on that February day nearly a year ago. And Beatrice, watching his face as he gazed at their child, felt a similar gratitude for the blizzard that had changed the course of her life in ways she could never have imagined when she set out for Rico with her wagon full of dreams. The years that followed brought changes both expected and surprising. William grew from a robust infant into an active toddler with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined spirit. The millinery shop flourished, expanding to include ready-made clothing and eventually employing 2 local girls as apprentices. Flynn's woodworking gained a reputation that spread far beyond Rico, with orders for his finely crafted furniture coming from as far away as Denver. 3 years after William's birth, a daughter joined their family, Elizabeth Grace, named for both their mothers. She arrived in the gentler month of May, with wildflowers carpeting the meadows around the cabin and the air soft with spring. The cabin expanded again to accommodate their growing family, with Flynn adding a schoolroom where Beatrice taught the children their letters and numbers before they were old enough to attend the schoolhouse in town. A vegetable garden flourished behind the house, providing fresh produce through the summer and fall, and a small orchard of apple and cherry trees eventually took root on the southern slope. Through it all, the joys and challenges, the prosperous years and the lean ones, Flynn and Beatrice remained each other's steadfast companions, their bond only deepening with time and shared experience. The wooden ring he had carved for her in those first snowy days of their acquaintance remained her most treasured possession, though it was eventually joined by a gold band purchased with the profits from their first truly successful year. On winter evenings, when the children were tucked in bed and the wind howled around the eaves, they would often sit by the fire, much as they had in those early days. Sometimes they talked of the future, of William's evident talent for his father's craft, of Elizabeth's quick mind and artistic eye that seemed destined for her mother's business. Sometimes they simply sat in companionable silence, content in each other's presence after a day of work and family obligations. And sometimes, when the snow fell particularly heavy, they would reminisce about that first blizzard, about a wagon tipping precariously in the wind, and a desperate rescue that had changed both their lives forever. "Do you ever wonder," Beatrice asked on one such night, as they sat wrapped in a quilt before the hearth, watching the flames dance, "what would have happened if you hadn't come along when you did? If you'd taken a different trail that day?" Flynn's arm tightened around her shoulders. "I try not to," he admitted. "The thought of what might have happened." He shook his head. "But I did come along, and you were brave enough to take my hand when I reached for you." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Maybe that's all that matters in the end, that when fate offers us a chance, we have the courage to take it." Beatrice nodded, leaning into his embrace. "I'm glad I took your hand that day," she said softly, "and every day since." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing their mountain home in pristine white. But inside, all was warmth and light and the quiet joy of a love that had begun in the heart of a blizzard and flourished through all the seasons that followed. A love born of rescue and resilience, of shared dreams and mutual respect, of two independent spirits who had discovered that together they were stronger than they had ever been apart. And as Flynn and Beatrice sat before the fire, their children sleeping peacefully in the rooms he had built with his own hands, they knew with absolute certainty that the life they had created together, unexpected, challenging, and utterly wonderful, was far more precious than any they might have imagined for themselves alone. A tipping wagon and a winter storm had brought them together. But it was choice, courage, and unwavering commitment that had forged their life from that chance beginning a life neither would trade for any other.